Whether you like history, luxury, or sport, or preserving, celebrating, and sharing automotive history, you've got 6 reasons to become a subscriber to the Audrain Museum Network right now. Press that button. Do it today. Welcome to our exhibition here at the Audrain Automobile Museum, History, Luxury, Sport, Automobiles in Newport. For this segment, I'm joined by my friend Nick Waller, the Executive Director of the Audrain Newport Concours d'Elegance, and we're here to talk about 3 very exciting sporting cars, all of which were winners in the past editions of the Audrain Newport Concours d'Elegance.
They were, and they each one really sums up its own decade. We have the 50s, we have the 60s, and we're going to be talking about the 70s later on. But really the 50s and 60s to me is where my heart is, it's where my heart lies. The 50s, the 60s, the swinging 60s, the 50s just coming out of a dire time for the world, and everybody wanted some excitement, and boy oh boy did they get it.
Absolutely, and we're starting with this 1958 Lancia Appia B24 convertibile. B24S convertibile. A Lancia B24S convertible. And this car is generously loaned to us by Lee and Heather Hauer.
Yep.
And it is just absolutely the quintessence of La Dolce Vita. This color, this wonderful soft gray is so 1950s and suits the shape so beautifully.
It really does. It's the Farina, before he became Pininfarina, before the company became Pininfarina, it was Farina.
No, this is a Pininfarina. Exactly. Not his brother, Carrozzeria Farina.
That's the
Stabilimenti Farina. Mi scusi. But
I knew you would pick me up on that. But no, as you said, the La Dolce Vita. It was that time where Italy were making fabulous movies, and we were talking about that earlier. And this car was a star, touring the somewhat empty roads of Italy and Europe. I just can't imagine anything better.
When you think about the place that a car was made for, and you think about the roads of Italy in the immediate post-war era, when Italy still was not totally motorized.
No,
at that
by no
point.
means.
There were lots of people on bicycles and scooters, and the lucky few in their Cinquecentos and Seicentos.
Yes.
But the people who could afford a car like this had the roads to themselves, and as you mentioned, this car being a movie star, not this particular example, but the Lancia B24 was the star of this wonderful movie called Il Sorpasso, which, interestingly enough, is billed as a comedy, but the ending is not really comedic, but it's a movie that has a lot of fun, a lot of smiles along the way.
Of course.
But the spirit of this car, and one of the things that also set Lancia apart, as we mentioned in the exhibition introduction video, is technology. Lancia was the first company to use what we now recognize as a unit body in 1922 with the Lambda.
Yep.
Vincenzo Lancia, the founder of the company in 1906, really brought a lot of new and exciting things to bear. This car, Lancia's first post-war model, has a specification that in the 1970s and 1980s would still be admirable. Narrow angle V6 engine, rear transaxle, inboard rear brakes.
Yeah.
I mean, astonishing specification.
It's all there. And of course it led to Lancia's brief but much lauded racing history. The post-war, the D24, it really did spawn that. It was built on, I believe, the same chassis. A lot of the same engineering went into it. And that in turn spawned, I think, yours and my favorite Grand Prix car of probably any era, the fabulous D50.
You know, it's a very interesting thing that when these 3 cars were chosen to talk about, I just realized now listening to you that they have something in common about their relationship to competition and what competition meant to the various companies that birthed them.
Yes, and Lancia more so than the other 2, but Lancia really, they never really were born as a racing car company, rather not like Ferrari, who wanted to earn money to go racing. Lancia was all about the engineering, as you say.
But that's the point. It's about wanting to race and not wanting to race. Vincenzo Lancia, who started his career, as many people did at the turn of the century, racing cars, he raced for Fiat quite successfully, decided when he started his own company he was not going to get into racing because racing was a sure way to make a small fortune out of a large fortune.
Absolutely.
When he passed away in 1937, the company turned over to his very young son, Gianni, who was basically in charge of the company in sort of a regency during the war, and when he came to age after the war, he took over the company. And of course, the first thing he wanted to do is go racing, because his father wouldn't do it. So he thought, we have to do this. And interestingly enough, if you study the books, the statistics, the most successful sports racing company in the mid-1950s was Lancia.
Yes, absolutely.
With their D23 and D24 racing cars, they won the Carrera Panamericana, the Mille Miglia,
Targa Florio, Giro di Sicilia.
Came in second and third at Le Mans with basically a production car. And then with the D50 was the only competition that Mercedes had in the 1955 season.
It really was. And sadly, if it hadn't been for Ascari's premature death at the wheel of a D50, I think that really brought about a seed change in the company when they really sold the racing department to Ferrari.
They gave it away department to Ferrari, who, by the way, won the World Championship with a Lancia in 1956. Yes. Now, one of the other things about that, of course, the fact that that very expensive racing program drove them to the brink. But one of the other things that helped them get there is the fact that this was an engineer's company. If there's a simple way to do something, that's not the Lancia way. They did it the best way possible. And these cars are incredibly over-engineered, spectacularly built. I'm sure that many people have seen our good friend Jay Leno on his channel drive his B24 convertible, and he goes on and on and on about just the way it was built and the way it feels. You feel the quality in it. I'm fortunate enough to own right now a 1962 Lancia Appia sedan. And Lancias are also typically the most expensive car in their class with the smallest engines.
Yes.
They weren't all about power and big output. They were about the driving experience.
And the style and how you go about it. Anybody can drive a car from A to B, but let's just have a little bit of style. And that's what really made Lancia's name around the world. My first car that I ever drove on the road on 10 past 7 a.m. in the morning of my 17th birthday was a Lancia Fulvia.
There you are.
And my father sitting alongside me, and I've been a Lancia fan ever since. I really have.
I have no idea that your taste had fallen so far from your very august beginnings.
Yes.
Let's get you back behind the wheel of a Lancia.
I know.
I can do that. So watch this space.
Fantastic.
It will happen. And again, telling a story of both great style and racing and not racing. The second car we're going to talk about, I know a great favorite of both yours and mine, the Lamborghini 350 GT. That is an extraordinary car, and actually it's very funny. When we were shooting the exhibition introduction video, there was a comment about the shape of the car, the fact that there were absolutely no straight lines on it, that everything curved into another, and you pointed out a straight line. And I realized something that I should have mentioned then, which is the fact that the Lamborghini GT350, the basic shape was designed by the great Franco Scaglione.
Yes.
And the prototype was the 350 GTV, a very different car that had hidden headlights and all sorts of wonderful, to my mind, features.
It could never have gone into production as it was designed. Like many great cars, it could never have gone in. No.
The Lamborghini 350 GT has the honor of having a double impossibility for going into production, because Giotto Pizzarini, who had designed the spectacular V12 engine, which put out 400 horsepower with an 11-to-1 compression ratio and wonderful downdraft Weber carburetors. Well, obviously he didn't look at what Franco Scaglione was drawing, because the engine didn't fit in the car. It was too tall.
I believe when they first showed it, the engine was sort of tack welded into the
engine was on a stand.
On the side. That's right. The whole thing was cobbled together. Like many great Lamborghini press releases, what you see is not perhaps what you're going to get.
Well, and it's also an interesting thing, because I go back to the straight line. If you look at the 350 GTV, there is a chrome accent strip that goes along the side and along the top of the flattened rear wheel arch. When Carrozzeria Touring redid the design for productionizing and put in the headlights, the standing headlights, they took off the trim strip, but they didn't change the shape of the rear wheel arch. So it's still flat at the top to accommodate.
So that's where that comes
trim.
in.
Exactly.
It was an echo of what had been before.
Precisely.
Interesting. I love these design discussions the history of the design of a car. And with this car in particular, it is fascinating because the GTV had the most complex curves in the front, the rear glass, the side glass was even curved, I believe. I saw it once.
With vent windows.
Exactly. I mean, beautiful design, and God bless them for building it in the first place, but God bless Touring for turning it into perhaps one of the most beautiful cars ever designed.
And just as Vincenzo Lancia did not want to go racing and Gianni Lancia went racing, one of the reasons why Giotto Bizzarini left the company basically before the company was launched after designing the engine was that he designed a race engine. So he thought, of course, you're going to go into competition with Ferrari, so obviously you're going to have a racing engine. And Ferruccio Lamborghini said, no, I am building road cars. I will never race.
And it had to be detuned, I believe, in order to go into production.
Exactly.
It had
from 400 to 270 horsepower.
Precisely. That's a lot of horses to let free run in the field.
But it's an amazing thing. Again, I was fortunate enough at the period in my life to own a Lamborghini Islero, which is the car which followed the 400 GT 2+2, the successor to this car. And driving an early Lamborghini is completely different than a modern one. The controls are very deliberate. We might even say heavy, which is very interesting because you look at the car and you think everything's going to be very light and very...
You have to remember Ferruccio Lamborghini's roots, and I mean roots. He came from a farming family. In 1948, he set up his tractor business, and from there, a leap from building wonderful blue and orange tractors, they're still around, they're still in use, to this is like a complete change of life.
But it's also natural because one of the things he complained about his Ferrari was the fact that it kept breaking. So he wanted to build something that was robust and fast. And he got that with these cars. And the Lamborghini 350 GT, the very first model, is also a very rare car. They built less than 300 of them before they moved on to the 4-liter and then the 2+2, which has a slightly modified body. And then from there to the Islero, the Espada. One of the things that is bewildering about Lamborghini, a very small company, they started in 1963. By 1970, they had already introduced 5 different models.
Isn't that extraordinary? And I still stand by my statement that I made before, which frankly I would have left it at that. I'd have been very happy to have built that car for the rest of my life.
I think many people would agree with you. And of course, the owner of that car, another great friend of the Audrain, Doug Cohen, was kind enough to loan it to us. And Doug is also someone who likes to drive his cars, and that's a glorious thing as well. So to see a car like that, which is wonderful sculpture, but also to know that the car is used and driven, because those cars are spectacular on the road.
It cries out to be driven. If that was in my garage, I would look at it every day, and if I didn't drive it that day, I'd feel guilty. It just is perfection to me. There isn't a line out of place, there isn't an angle that you can't adore. It really is truly one of my top 3 cars of all time.
It is extraordinary. And one of the reasons, of course, that it's so much fun to drive is, again, Lamborghini was expert at getting great talent in. I mean, in addition to Giotto Bizzarini to design his engine, the basic chassis, Gianpaolo Dallara came in and refined the car for production. So here's someone who would go on to build most of the race chassis that were used in open wheel racing, someone who really understood what chassis dynamics were all about.
And it was never raced.
Vaguely, Lamborghini endorsed effort was when they went into Formula One, and that was just at the time when they sold the company to Chrysler. They were developing this engine, which turned out, as Ferruccio thought, would be too heavy and useless, but nonetheless, there they were racing. And speaking of cars that were born to race, but never quite did, the BMW M1. This is a car, we've got a 1980 example here, the last year of production. And this car was loaned to us by our friend Neil Heffron. And I love stories of manufacturers who start out with great intentions and put great effort into things that never quite work out. And poor Jochen Nierpasch,
yes,
who was the head of BMW Motorsport, this is his baby, his pet project, and it cost him his job.
Yes, it's such a shame. They went to, I think BMW went to, they wanted a race. Mm-hmm. They were doing great with the 3-litre CSL.
Right.
Winning all over the world. Fabulous car, but they wanted something for Group 5 to go racing. Group 5, rear engine, this is what they needed. The prototype for this, rather like our previous cars, was a little bit more than BMW wanted to spend on their production car and their race cars. It had gull wing, doors, it had the flavor of the M1, but it was a little too much. But from there grew what we see here, the M1.
And it's one of those things, much like the great Group B cars, that were planned and executed, and then, oh wait, we've got no place to use them.
Yeah.
But Nierpasch was so far down the road, he said, okay, I've got a great idea. I'm going to sell a single mark support series to Formula One, and we can actually use these cars in what became the Pro Car series.
Pro Car, exactly.
A fascinating idea. The top 5 qualifiers in the Formula One race would race these identical M1s against a bunch of amateur races, in effect.
It was a Pro-Am. It was a Pro-Am. And what a fabulous idea.
Fabulous idea, but what could possibly go wrong?
Well, it had a troubled start, of course, because much like the 350 GT we were talking about, Lamborghini had been involved with the early prototype, etc., etc. When Lamborghini ran into trouble in the early 70s, 1970, 71, they had to look around. And they went to Ital Design.
Ital Design, exactly. It's one of the projects that sort of really established Ital Design. They were, of course, the design consultancy that had already at that point designed the VW Golf and Scirocco and lots of things for Audi. Yeah. So they were on their way, but this actually put them in the manufacturing business, which was quite interesting. And the idea behind this car, much like people would talk about years later with the Acura/Honda NSX, this was a supercar, a race car for the road that they wanted to make sure, BMW wanted to make sure that it was a comfortable car that could be actually usable, even though it was this very limited production thing, and they succeeded. The M1 is a really interesting car to drive, and it's very funny. Jay and I drove one on his show, and it was very funny because Jay's reaction was somewhat muted, and I understand where he was coming from, because much like the NSX, it does what it does so unobtrusively, you think, this isn't a supercar, this isn't a race car, this is a BMW.
Yeah.
But they actually achieve their aim quite brilliantly.
But I think that's a BMW trait. I've got to be honest. That is a totally BMW trait. Great cars, but you don't quite realize that you're driving a great car. Until
you realize how fast you're going and how effortlessly you're doing it. This was, of course, also the first mid-engine BMW. Also a car that marked the start as a commercial venture of the M, the motorsport, the M as a road car high-performance derivative. And one of the funny things about the design of the car, which I absolutely love, they wanted to put, the classic BMW symbols on it. So it has, the tiny kidney grille, which is very different than the giant kidney grills we have today.
Don't get me started, but yes, there we are.
My favorite thing is the fact that it's got 2 BMW roundels on the rear fenders, as if to say, well, if you pass me on the left, you're passing a BMW. You pass me on the right, you're passing a BMW. But actually, it's when I pass you on the left, you're being passed by a BMW. When I pass you on the right, you're being passed by a BMW.
BMW have always had that problem. When they had the 2002, if you remember the 2002 Turbo, if you had one behind you and you looked in your mirror and you thought, what's that? You could see Turbo written the proper way around because it was reversed under the front air dam. I love BMW's identity crisis.
One of the other things which is so great about this car, and very much of the period, late 70s, when you look at cars like the Volkswagens, the Audis of the time, The interior of the car is incredibly sober. It's very, very simple, which is also, some say, a design decision that they made because the cars were hand-built in very small numbers. They didn't want to have a very complex interior because things can go wrong and start to rattle and all this. So the interior is very simple, again, for a car which was very expensive. And that, I think, was another challenge, which is the fact that the natural market, or a natural market for this car, of course, would have been the United States.
Yeah.
But they never sold them here new.
How many did they build?
I think they built somewhere around 200 or so, and,
Really?
and 25 of them were the race cars.
Yeah.
So the balance being road cars. And they are absolutely amazing today. Of course, fortunately, we can enjoy them today in the United States without modification since they are over 25 years old. And they are still somewhat of a sleeper in the collector car market because they've had such a small audience that the values haven't really been crazy. So you can get a car which is very, very special, very low production number, amazing design, and really something that this is a challenge that BMW has had. BMW has built great road cars. They built great, what you would call saloon races, sedan racing cars. And they've always had this history of making a sort of an outlier, sexy sports car that had nothing to do with the rest of what they were doing. Yeah. This is sort of a modern 507.
Yes, absolutely right.
It accomplished a bit more than a 507, but had nothing to do with what BMW was doing. Of course, that 507,
it was like BMW, yes, BMW, yes. Along comes the 507, you go, whoa! But then it disappeared again.
Exactly.
And they went back to, BMW.
And
yes, very
so
interesting.
with the entire history of what this car cost and what it meant to the company, when the idea of a successor to the M1 came up, they said, "Nein, danke, there will not be one." Yeah. And so it's more's the shame. I mean, I think that certainly BMW today would benefit greatly from a great flagship car like this. Yeah. And I sort of thought that they were thinking along those lines when they came out with the i8, because I think the i8 sort of is a modern M1.
Yes.
But of course, it wasn't perceived that way by folks, and of course they never thought about racing i8s, so
no, wasn't not a serious problem. Now, remind me, there was the art car too.
Yes.
The M1 painted by some of the artists of the day, Warhol, I want to say Stravinsky, it's not Stravinsky.
I think
Kandinsky,
the BMW,
possibly?
I think the BMW M1 was a Calder, thank you. So this has been a great excursion through the decades with you, Nick. And each of these cars has a really special appeal, and it's no wonder that they were chosen as award winners at the Audrain Newport Concours d'Elegance.
Yes, they were worthy winners, and I remember each one, and there was very little competition on the day. They were, each one and every one was a perfect winner.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all very much for joining us on this segment. And be sure to come back here to the channel to watch other highlights from this exhibition, History Luxury Sports, Automobiles in Newport. Thanks for joining us.